Hello and welcome. I'm Robbie,
And I'm Jay.
and you're joining us for episode 27 of Generations Apart, the show where we chat about gaming and technology across the generations, sharing our perspectives on the past and our excitement for the future. On today's episode, we're talking about the strange world of Nintendo 3DS hacking. What is it, and why are 3DS owners going down this rabbit hole? Before that, though, Jay, what's piqued your interest this week?
Thank you, Robbie. Well, I brought you an unusual one this week. It's Microsoft Teams specific, and it's available right now. And it's to do with a collaboration between Microsoft and Maybelline, Maybelline, the beauty app provider. They have created 12 unique looks that you can apply to your face via Teams digitally using ModiFace AI. And apparently what it does is it identifies 70 points of your face to create a virtual map, which then enables the seamless application of these digital filters. So you can now apply makeup or different looks to improve your image through these new apps. Apparently they're available in-app already, being slowly rolled out to various enterprises. So if yours aren't there yet, then keep checking and they will be in the future. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting development from Maybelline. And an interesting development, I guess, in kind of how we present ourselves virtually and giving people tools that can help them to feel more confident. When I first read it, I'll be honest, my first impression was, that's a bit odd. But then I thought, well, people do it all the time with Instagram filters and things like that. And actually, why should you have to worry about what you look like on camera in the morning? We're all forced to be on camera so long now during our working days that actually maybe a little bit of help just to feel a little more comfortable in our own skin would be welcome. So yeah, there you go. Maybelline bringing virtual makeup to Microsoft Teams is what I've brought for you this week.
It's interesting bringing this to like a business conferencing app, like a business calling app. I guess that's what Teams is specifically aimed for. Yeah, I don't know. This does feel like you mentioned Instagram filters. That feels like an outsider work thing. So I guess why not bring it to work?
They've put it under the category of filters in the app. But even before this, Microsoft had introduced in one of its more recent updates a kind of digital smoothing effect just to kind of enhance the way you looked, which you could toggle on and off. And for some reason, my work Teams instance was obsessed with toggling on every time I opened up a call. So I kept having this like super smooth and slightly glistening. And I thought, I know my eyes don't look like that. Where's all the bags gone and the wrinkles? And then I realised this effect was turned on. So I don't know what the 12 effects are. I think some of them are more extreme than others. They're not all aimed at like women, so they're not all makeup necessarily. Some of it is kind of digitally just kind of smoothing and enhancing just to make you look your best. But it's predominantly, applying makeup effects. I guess it can't be too severe because it'd look a bit odd if suddenly it started to clip or did something obscure.
Yeah.
You're on a recorded Teams call and suddenly your lips are over here somewhere or whatever it might be. But
I have seen that before, because I think Zoom has a very similar feature where it can enhance your face, but you can toggle things on and off, like I don't know, making features darker, like I don't know, your eyebrows or something like that, and adding lipstick on, things like that, making your lips a different color. And then if you do something like cover your hand over your mouth, you can see the lipstick suddenly on your hand instead of your mouth, which is a bit of an odd thing to see on the camera. So you can actually like see the filters. It'd be interesting how they handle that kind of tracking. It can be a bit weird and I imagine a little distracting for anyone who's on the call with them.
That's a very fair point. And I guess you'd like to think that in order for a brand like Maybelline, whose parent company is L'Oreal, didn't know that. I would like to think that they wouldn't put their name to this unless it had gone through some rigorous testing, because as you said, it could be embarrassing from a brand perspective. And
very true.
Having 70 points of articulation on your face feels like a good number, but these things are always improving, aren't they? I'm always blown away by the Instagram filters and some of the stuff they can do with those now, and those are just done for fun. So when something's applied in a professional environment, you'd like to think that it's been well tested. Having said that, how many, Teams blurred background struggles to cut out my head, and I've got a bald head. How hard can that be? You'd think that that's a fairly solid edge, but it seems to have a real trouble. I think it's almost like it's designed to feather, to give to work with hair,
Yeah.
and doesn't cope well with a bald head because it doesn't know what to do with the sort of cleaner line. Very odd, but anyway, there you go. So Maybelline and Teams bringing beauty filters to your Teams calls.
Randomly, I've just noticed as well, in this image as at the top of the article, under video effects, it shows you the Maybelline filters, but there's also a separate tab called avatars, and I wonder if they're going to introduce avatars as well.
I think Teams have already confirmed they're doing that, aren't they? I think that's.
Oh, I hadn't seen that.
I think that's
cool.
coming. Yeah, I think avatars is coming to give you a break, basically, if you don't want to be. Again, if you're not presentable and you don't want to be seen on camera, you can turn your avatar on instead.
Interesting.
Which I have heard people sort of. There was a lot of mockery aimed towards both Meta and Apple when they talked about the idea of avatars in your FaceTime calls. But actually, there's bound to be studies being undertaken at the moment, if not already done, that must be looking at the effects of being on video calls all day, every day, and constantly being exposed to both your own image, your own reflection on an almost permanent basis throughout your working day, but also that consciousness of being constantly watched. So actually, if an avatar can bridge that gap and people start to kind of get comfortable with it, I personally wouldn't have any issue using an avatar at work. And I know my kids think they're hilarious on the iPhone when you turn your Memoji on and it replaces you on a FaceTime call. Yeah. But, as long as it's kind of professional for work, I suppose, and it looks a little bit like you, I think that's absolutely fine. Personal opinion, though. I know not everyone will agree.
Fair enough. Very cool.
What about you, Robbie? What piqued your interest?
So, since our last episode with Sam Smith, and we chatted about CoPilot and other Microsoft-related tools, there was an announcement, and we completely blew past it. We didn't even mention last week in the episode that Microsoft Ignite is the a kind of an event that they hosted last week to talk about the latest developments in Microsoft. And one of the announcements specifically related to CoPilot is that they've announced the pricing. And there is kind of mixed feelings about the pricing, I think, generally online. It's $30 per user per month. And to put that in context, a standard E5 license is about £35. So an enterprise license for one user is £35 per month per user. So a lot of people are complaining because it's like almost doubling their subscription just to use CoPilot with a normal Microsoft license. But the other thing to take in context is, would you? It's $30 per month per user versus hiring someone specifically to do some of these admin tasks. I think is the alternative argument. If you're going to have a business case for, we need help on this specific project, or this team needs help with some of their admin, we need to either hire someone, or there might be a use case for just getting CoPilot for $30 a month, $30 a month. So mixed reception, I think, on the cost.
Yeah, we seem to have a bad track record the last few episodes of doing an episode on a topic and then almost instantly between recording and publishing having more facts come out. We had the same problem with the Xbox case.
Yes, we did.
Yeah, I saw this, and yes, the reaction, as you said, has been mixed. I think a lot of people were surprised. I think there was an expectation that maybe it would be around the $10 mark per user per month. Obviously, it's coming at 3 times that. I get your point around, the business case and, well, it's going to save you hiring someone. Most organizations, though, probably aren't looking to hire at the moment. They're looking to cut back. So I'm assuming they'd have to invest in this, prove that it worked, and then make people redundant. And it feels like it's a surprising move to put this kind of price on it, because at the moment, of course, ChatGPT, OpenAI, completely free, albeit not offering the same capabilities we're discussing here. But it feels like a barrier that's going to put people off, or almost give IT teams an excuse to go, well, we probably shouldn't buy this and implement it at all the different challenges it's going to present, because frankly, it's just crazy expensive. We haven't budgeted for this. Whereas if it was cheaper, then it's harder to push back on. And then it feels like the sort of thing that once people are hooked and they see the value, not the nicest practice, but you'd start to creep that price up
That's
when
the
people
traditional
are
Microsoft model as
invested.
well.
Yeah, it does seem strange to come in at this price point, and I think it will put people off. Ultimately, though, I suppose what's going to end up, what they're banking on, is enough people buying into it that their competitors feel compelled to do so just to keep up.
Yeah.
And it ends up being one of those things that it's not a differentiator, you just have to have it.
Yeah. I think
But
that's
it's a
the
big
ultimate
price point.
The end goal is obviously just incorporating it by default in the normal subscription. Yeah, it's hard to tell, where they're going to go pricing wise. Maybe this is that, lower pricing, and it is going to increment over time, as you suggested as well. So who knows? Who knows?
I've never been involved in negotiating these agreements with Microsoft. When it comes to per user per month, I mean, are they going to be giving users the option to only apply it for certain audiences? Or is it one of those, it's per user per month, but you have to pay for every user in your licensing agreement, and that's how you calculate the cost? Or will you be able to implement it in some areas and not in others, give it to certain end users who do certain tasks and keep it from others to save money?
Yeah.
That's what's going to be interesting.
Well, so typically,
I don't have enough experience in negotiating them to know the difference.
Sure. No, so typically, the way it seems to be configured, or at least what I've seen for the kind of licensing stuff, is so you have the base license, which is E3 or E5 or whichever E it is for the enterprise wide, which gives you a base license for everyone in the business. And then you can do like add-ons per users. So you could buy like a bucket of, say, 100 CoPilot licenses and dish them out to 100 people in the business. So you wouldn't have to, I imagine, buy for everyone up front. It would be, you would flip a switch somewhere on their account so that they could access CoPilot as long as there's enough licenses in that bucket to dish out.
Fair enough. Well, it'll be interesting then. I mean, it's going to be a powerful tool if it delivers everything they're promising. I think what's going to be interesting from a drafting point of view is, and I've had this feedback, is that people feel that they're able to more easily identify when something has been drafted using this kind of tech. That there's certain language and certain styles that it uses that give it away. It'll be interesting to see how clever Copilot is at learning either your organization style or your personal style, so that if you're having it draft large form documents, that it doesn't mean you rewriting things or restyling things to avoid being spotted. Is Copilot going to start to look and feel similar between organizations, and then you'll be able to tell when someone's used Copilot to draft something? I don't know.
You can only tell, I think, once you get your hands on it. And this is something as well. It's going to get better. It's not going to be as it is forever when you first get it. So I imagine it'll learn over time. It just will get better. But I guess the price, there's a few things that are in that. The massive investment in OpenAI, I think, is a big part of why they're charging a bit more. But also, it's quite a lot of compute power to power these features. It mentions in the article the kind of scramble for GPUs that Microsoft and many other tech companies have had to do just to power features like this using AI. It's very, very intensive as a compute resource. So that obviously feeds into it as well. So I don't know. It does seem expensive on the face of it, but I imagine the cost to run these features is probably quite high.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's not cheap technology, and I suppose it's a differentiator for them at the moment. So while it remains that way, they may as well profit from it, because those prices will probably have to come down as competitors get into the market, or they'll set a precedent and that will just be the sort of cost of doing business. True. And other competitors will come in at a similar price.
True.
Who knows?
Very true.
Cool. Interesting.
Well,
typical that followed days after our episode.
I know, it's classic Jay and Robbie timing. But there we go. We're giving the update now. It's my piqued interest. Cool. So into today's topic. This is probably going to be a relatively quick one, but it was a topic given to me by a friend of mine who has started to do this himself, and it was an interesting kind of rabbit hole that he'd got into, and suggested that maybe we talk about it on the podcast. And I hadn't really heard of it before that. But in doing the research for the episode, it actually seems like quite an interesting area, and opens up the conversation around console hacking generally. And so in my research, I was looking at, say, like the history of console hacking or game machine hacking anyway. And I remembered I watched a Netflix documentary called High Scores. It's a really good one. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's about the history of gaming, and it starts with the arcade machines, the old Atari machines back in the day. And one of the stories in there was about two MIT students who they owned, I think, a few of these machines and put them in the halls in the accommodation they were staying at as students. And they found that the games were a bit too easy, and people would learn how to complete the game, and so they wouldn't hang around and use it as often. They wouldn't keep funding it. So they developed I would say a hack, but some modification to this arcade machine to make it harder so that people would stick around longer and start funding the machines a bit more. And so that, I think, for me, is like the earliest, in my research, I could find the earliest example of console hacking. Atari later had legal action against them, of course, but because I think they ended up, if I remember rightly from the documentary, and don't quote me from this, I think they ended up shipping these mod kits that you could attach to your arcade machines and then selling them as a kind of separate business. And Atari caught wind of how successful they were being, and then they got into a legal battle with them. But just the origins of, you've got a game that was built by a company, you've got a console or a machine that's built by another company, and you want to enhance it and make it any different, or make it harder in this case, has been around for a while. So us talking about the topic today, it's not something that's new as a concept, kind of hacking consoles. It has been around for a very long time. And I actually dabbled a bit in this in the past. You'll be shocked to know, Jay, with my Android history. But actually, I used to own a Nintendo DS, and there used to be these things called, instead of a cartridge, you could buy it's what's called an R4 card, which had a micro SD slot, so that you could add things like music, films, and homebrew games, or whatever games you could find in the internet land, interwebs. So that was my earliest experience, I think, with getting hands on with some of the hacking, because you could use your own software. You didn't have to use the software that was built into the DS as well. But yeah, Jay, I don't know if this is a world you've been exposed to, tried out before, heard stories of. I always harken back. In fact, Christine and I was joking the other day, when we were a kid, there was always a guy that your dad knew who would chip PlayStation consoles and would have these knockoff games that he would sell you. And if you had any stories or anything like that.
I had a friend whose dad knew people like that, and used to send home chipped Sky boxes that could access all the channels and stuff like that. Yes, much to your surprise, I've no doubt I have more than dabbled in this space before. I got an R4 cartridge for my other half's DS back in the day. Did not fill that full of movies. I filled it full of other other games and emulators, ROMs. Personally, I had, and I still have somewhere, there was a pack that you could buy for the PS1. It was like a device that plugged into the serial port on the back of the console, and then you got a small spring that had to go between the lid and the console, and it basically allowed you to play. So you'd boot the console with one disc. The spring kept the console believing its lid was down, so then you could take the disc out, put your copy disc in, and then this device on the back would bypass certain software or hardware in the device to allow you to run copied games.
Yeah.
So I will confess I had a couple of copied PS1 games back in the day. And interestingly, I fell foul of, I think I told you this before, about Metal Gear Solid. The Metal Gear Solid 1 has an anti-copy thing built in. And the developers back in the day, before it was sort of software and sophisticated like it is now, would find creative ways to prevent or to ruin the experience for people who were playing bootleg copies of games. So with Metal Gear Solid 1, on the back of the official game box was one of many screenshots, and one of them was of the intercom system that you use in the game, and it had a specific code pre-punched into it, like a frequency for the radio. And at a certain point in the game, when you need to interact with Meryl, they tell you to look on the back of the box. They kind of break the fourth wall, and if you haven't got the box, you can't put the code in that you need to talk to Meryl and to continue playing the game. And I remember hitting that point in the game. My friend had lent me the copy, And I was like, what do I do? He said, it says, look on the back of the box. What am I supposed to be looking at? And he said, oh, don't worry. It's written on that scrap of paper that I shoved inside the CD jewel case. And I was like, oh,
Glamorous
that's the code I'm supposed to put in. Yeah, yeah. So that was my kind of earliest experience, I think, probably with bootleg. I also did own a chipped PS2 Slim back in the day. So I'd had my PS2 for a long, long time. And towards the end of its life, I had bought a pre-chipped PlayStation 2 Slim. And this is early Netflix or Love Film days. I used to hire a game, copy it on my personal computer, burn it to a disc and send it back. Horrible confession there, get me into trouble. So I had a little library of copied PS2 games back in the day, as long with all the ones I bought and owned as well. But when I started to get a bit more into my tech and I started to discover these things were all possible, I was doing it more because I could. Ironically, through Love Film, I very rarely got the game I really wanted. You used to get all the shit you'd fill your list with. So I was very rarely copying games I actually cared about, but I had a little collection of copied games on that console. Beyond that, I don't think I've ever really had anything else kind of chipped or hacked. I know that it was possible with the Xbox back in the day, and that worked really well for people because your hard drive was kind of baked in. You could install your copied games and play them directly from there. I know that portable things like the PSP and the Vita in the past have had emulators and been jailbroken. So very aware of it. And of course, back in the day, like everyone in the late 90s, early noughties, Napster, LimeWire, all those sorts of things were a thing. Back when I had no money and the knowledge and the skills to find these things. I don't dabble so much now, at all now, because I'm fortunate to be able to kind of buy the things that I want to play or experience. But yeah, 100% done it in the past.
Yeah, and that's I think what's the weird thing about this Nintendo 3DS hacking is that it's such an obvious thing, but it's completely flew past me. It used to be a world that I knew a fair bit about. I had friends, for example, you mentioned Xbox before. I actually had a friend who used to have copied games, and he actually got permanently banned from Xbox Live because they managed to find out somehow. So it's a world that I used to know a bit more about, but I think since growing older and having money and buying games and stuff myself, it's not really anything I'm into at the moment. So yeah, I mean, it seems an obvious thing to see, but what's quite interesting about this is there's a bit of a recent incentive for the 3DS to blow this up even more, and we'll get onto that in a second. But before we get into that, I wanted to chat just very quickly about the tech specs of the 3DS, which I guess it could be important as to why it's become a bit of a phenomenon at the moment for why it's prime for this kind of hacking. But the 3DS, it was released in 2011, so it's 12 years old now, which means that the tech inside is probably not super, super powerful. But even at the time, I don't think it was, groundbreaking performance for a handheld. I mean, I think on our earlier episodes, we were looking at like the PSP and other consoles that were released around the same time, which were much more powerful.
Yeah, I was going to say that would have been around the time of the PSP, wouldn't it? But
yeah.
So that would check out.
Yeah. What was unique about this one is it had that 3D screen. You didn't need. In fact, actually, Jay, I'm lecturing you on this, and you've got one. But I guess
it's behind me over there somewhere. And Mario's holding it. If you can see him in the background,
I can actually see that.
There you
go. Yeah, I see. But yeah, so they had that 3D screen. You didn't need to wear glasses to use it, and it was kind of a 3D effect. 2 screens that flipped up like a flip phone, but wider, obviously. And if you've seen DSs before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It had Wi-Fi and it had a camera, which was an interesting. I don't think there was many games that made use of that. And again, we've chatted about this previously, but
so there's a couple of subtle differences because what's over my shoulder is the new 3DS.
Yeah,
air quotes. That's what they called it. And on the early 3DS, which would have been released in 2011, I don't think it had a front-facing camera. It was only on the back.
Oh, okay.
But in later iterations, they put a front-facing camera on, and that camera is used to track the position of your eyes to more accurately recreate the 3D effect, because it didn't take much to move out of the kind of optimum viewing angle to lose the effect and to cause kind of headaches and all sorts of problems on the original. Whereas the new 3DS has a camera on the inside of the flip that monitors your eyes to try and keep that in the right place. Which I only learned the other day while watching a YouTube video of someone breaking down all of the Nintendo consoles. So can't pretend that I knew that until very recently. But there you go.
It also says it had 2 outer cameras. I'm assuming that was for 3D capture
I think
stuff.
it was, yeah, so you could create 3D images.
Very cool. Very, very cool. And it had like an analog stick, I guess, but a flat one that you could move around, which was quite unique for that console as well.
Yeah. That made a big difference in terms of sort of the 3D games. And not 3D as in 3D effect, but just 3D games in general, which previous iterations didn't have.
Yeah. And lastly, it had an SD slot, which I think is an interesting addition. It means that the R4 card is not required for a device like this, because there's already expandable storage and a way of getting things on and off the device using portable storage.
Yeah.
So that's quickly just going through the tech specs. Now, the history, or I guess the recent development, which has really pushed people to start hacking their 3DSs more, is a recent story around Nintendo closing a couple of their older stores, including the 3DS store and the Wii U store. So if you own a 3DS, as of, I believe it was March, 27th of March, this year, if you own a 3DS after that date, you can't buy new games from the store, basically. So I think that prompted a lot of people to, find out other ways of getting new games onto their system, say for not having access to the store anymore. And I think that's what's caused a bit of a blow up in this space, to the point where if you look up the 3DS on eBay or somewhere else that you could buy it, I think it's as expensive, if not more expensive, as the RRP when it first was released, and because it's become such a phenomenon at the moment. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, isn't it? Because obviously you can still buy physical games, but there's so many games, especially on the Wii and on the 3DS, which were kind of digital store, shovelware, or indie titles that never actually got a physical release. That now there are hundreds of games, if not thousands, that are just lost to time, that you can no longer get access to unless you do what you're talking about, which I guess is why this has become more of a phenomenon than it perhaps was before, because for video game purists or preservationists, now they've got no means to access this.
Yeah.
And interestingly, if you follow the Completionist on YouTube, his team did a really interesting video where they bought every game on the 3DS.
I'd heard about
store. This. Yeah, it sounds kind of crazy, and you think, oh yeah, it's just YouTubers doing something extreme. But actually, what they did and how they had to go about it was really complicated. They had to have multiple 3DSs. They had to buy all these cards. They had to spend a certain amount. They worked out how many thousands of pounds they needed to spend, or dollars, to be able to buy every game. Then they had to go and buy the equivalent in vouchers, because they couldn't just do it on the store. They had to buy cards, scratch them off, redeem them all. They had stacks of them. And then they had to download them onto a number of consoles, because the storage could obviously only take so many games. And I think it wasn't so much the storage that was the problem. It was the software being unable to recognize so many games in one library.
Yeah.
They had to spread it across multiple devices. They did eventually achieve it. And what they've done is they've donated all of those consoles and all of those games to this like video game preservationist organization, who's going to effectively look after them. And they even backed them all up and all sorts of stuff to make sure that they've got copies of their purchases, because of course if one of those consoles dies and is irreparable, then you're stuffed. And I don't know where you stand. I don't know whether you found this out in your research, so kind of question for you really. If the store is closed, does that mean you can no longer download purchases that you've made digitally if you haven't already got them downloaded, or is it just the purchasing of new content?
Yeah, there was some kind of an ominous note on this in the article I read that said, for now, you're still able to download your own content. And I think it was even things like updates on games that you already owned and downloaded. You would still receive things like that. But it was mostly just the purchasing, I think, of new games was not possible.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But even so, I suppose it's, like you said, a matter of time before they then close that store or your library altogether,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
they
that's
can't
the
keep that
scary
going
bit.
forever.
That is
Yeah.
the scary bit.
And do you know what? That is kind of the reason that I've pivoted back to physical collecting. There was a moment, and I think we've talked about this on a number of episodes before, where I was kind of all in on digital. I was buying digital for the Xbox. I'd got an all digital version of the PS5. I didn't need the discs anymore. I was absolutely cool to have this digital collection. And then as I found a love for the nostalgia for the collecting of my old stuff, it's changed my opinion on how
Yeah.
I want to buy new. And actually, I still prefer to have the physical disc, cartridge, whatever it might be, where possible, because it's nice to have them, one, to look at and on a shelf, but it also means that I mean, I'm not saying I'll never have that problem. There'll be other problems that modern technology will present, but at least theoretically, in 10 or 15 years' time, I should be able to put that disc in and run that game.
Yeah.
Although that might not happen for a number of other types of reasons, but at least the game's there. I don't have to worry about a digital store. So I've recently, I think I've told you, I've sold my digital PS5 on, and
Yeah.
I've bought a disc edition again, just as they're rumouring a PS Pro, by the way. Can you believe it?
Yeah, that's what I'm waiting for.
Yeah, standard. That's the rumour that it's coming. So, but I've done that in order to be able to buy the physical discs again. And the other reason as well that's a challenge here is that when you've got all these digital games, I don't know about you, I forget that I own them. They're kind of just buried in a list on a console. Unless I turn it on and go seeking them out, there's games even now that I forget that I've purchased in the past and downloaded at some point that I now technically have in a library.
It's like being hit with the wall of games that you get in Game Pass and just being completely overwhelmed with what you want to actually play.
Or sitting down in front of the TV and going, what shall I watch tonight? I've got Netflix, I've got Amazon Prime, I've got Disney Plus. Where do I even start? Yeah. So sometimes it's nice to be able to peruse a shelf, pick something up, have a look at it, handle it. And also for me, there's the memories attached to the physical. But,
yeah.
Sorry, I'm sidetracking.
No, you're absolutely right. I think that feeds into this conversation because it's about ownership and it's about access, right? So if you're owning physical copies of things, you'll always have access. But when it's digital copies, like the sheer amount of games that you may have owned on the 3DS store for the foreseeable is still accessible. But given the trend of turning off the store for new games, the likelihood of having access to all your games forever, I think, is unlikely. But even buying new games for the 3DS is now impossible. So it's not as if I think you can still buy the cartridges as well, not just the digital stuff. But that's not everything. You don't get access to everything from the physical cartridges. In particular, the article I read mentioned you'll no longer be able to access the virtual consoles which housed more than 530 classic game titles. And I think in many cases was the only way to access a lot of the classic Nintendo games. So there's no way of accessing and downloading those games anymore as part of this move.
Well, and you know what? This does in a weird way connect to this the nostalgic collecting that I've been kind of doing now for the last couple of years and buying up games I remember as a kid, and that price, by the way, has continued to climb in terms of accessing this stuff. This doesn't just the sort of a lack of access to games doesn't just cover the digital store for the 3DS. It's true of video game consoles going back decades. If you think about it now, there are hundreds, thousands of games which are only accessible via the original cartridge they were released on back in the 90s or the 80s, because whatever reason, digital versions don't exist anywhere else. There's no library you can go and buy them from. There's nowhere else to play them. Some of these games are trapped on 20, 30-year-old pieces of hardware. And there's no legitimate way, theoretically, to purchase these and to gain access to these, because the only way to get them is if you can, because not all games are emulated, is through emulation and ROMs. Which then brings into question the legality of what you're doing. But if it's the only way to access something, perhaps then it's more reasonable. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the questions I was going to pose at the end, and maybe we can touch on it right at the end about your thoughts about whether it's a legitimate thing to do now because the access is so restricted. But I think we're on the topic of being locked to a specific console that maybe is a classic console now. we're going to get to a stage, I think, where there's going to be digital exclusive content, which will perhaps be lost once that console generation has moved on. Where there won't be a physical copy that you can use on the original console back in the day. It'll be completely digital exclusive, and once that store is turned off, there's no chance of accessing that game again. So I can see the need for that preservation organization that you mentioned, the game preservation, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Well, and that was kind of what I was referring to with the PS5 decision.
Yeah,
I've solved one small problem in the now, in that I can now buy games again that are not £70 on a digital store. But there's no guarantee in 20 years' time that I turn the PS5 on and stick the disc in that the game will work. I'll probably get the buggy first version because it was patched 20 or 30 times before it became obsolete. True. Will I still be able to access those patches? Will it even work without an internet connection or access to an online server? So obviously online games won't, but single player adventures, will they still work? It's an interesting challenge, and you're quite right. In a world where so much is offered as digital incentives for pre-ordering this version or that version or whatever, even I'll be honest, even buying sort of older games secondhand is difficult, because now so many of these games came with essential content bundled for the first person who redeems them, that even if you buy the game, buy the disc, you're not getting the full experience, or potentially won't get the full experience in the future, because, as you say, certain exclusive content is gated away and is either not purchasable because it was an exclusive, or maybe isn't purchasable anymore because the game store doesn't exist. It's not supported by the developer anymore. I don't know. Any number of reasons that make game preservation so much more challenging for modern day games. Not least the volume of them as well that's out there these days. But
yeah, and specifically Nintendo, I guess hence the conversation. They're very locked to specific consoles more than any of the other console manufacturers. Nintendo games are not available on any other console really, so it's even harder for those who love those titles to access these games over time.
Well, it's not even just a Nintendo problem, it's a Nintendo hardware problem. So it's not just Nintendo's family of consoles. Often, because of the way they innovate with their hardware, some of these games will only work on one piece of hardware. If you look at the DS and the 3DS as examples, where else are people going to have two screens, one of which they can touch and a control pad to be able to engage with the game?
Yeah.
So, you can emulate them. Yes, absolutely can. But it's not the same experience. It's very hard to replicate that experience when the hardware makes that experience so unique. And, you've got that with the Wii as well. Very difficult to replicate Wii games on other consoles. Even the Switch. I mean, the Switch has got a degree of motion control in the Joy-Cons that makes it sort of backwards compatible. But there's no real easy way to replicate with the Wii without that hardware.
Yeah.
So again, the hardware, its scarcity, finding it in functioning order, all these things are going to make that a challenge moving forward as the hardware starts to break down. There's less and less of them available. They become faulty, irreparable, can't get parts for them. There's a number of challenges that make that difficult, especially in Nintendo's space, where they are so unique in terms of the interface with the game.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what do they do when they hack the 3DS devices? There is a specific website that I was sent by a friend of mine. There's a friend who's tried it now. I'm interested to see whether there's something that you'd be interested in trying as well. Having owned a 3DS, I can see your head shaking. So I'll take that as a no.
No, I don't like to mess with the hardware.
You want it to just work, Jay. We already know this.
Yeah, it's not so much that I don't like to mess with something. I like it. I'm a purist, so we'll touch on it later. But we talk about emulation. It's great. I think Sam touched on it last week. Being able to sit on the train or the bus and play Mario Kart on your Android. I get it, and that there's it's cool. There's a novelty value to that. But for me, as a purist, Pokemon on my iPhone or my Android isn't the same experience nostalgia-wise as playing it on a Game Boy.
Yeah.
And again, I could hack it and get it to do things it's not supposed to do. I think I'd be less against hacking it if I was just hacking it to put games on that were already designed for that thing.
Yeah.
So perhaps not entirely against it, but I just don't like the idea of messing with the platform because again, I'm kind of a purist. I like the design. I like it to work the way that the manufacturer intended, um, for better or worse. But I don't know that I would be up for this. But
Mm,
I'm interested to learn about it. So go on, take me
yeah,
through
yeah,
it, and let's
yeah.
find out.
Well, so I mean, as with a lot of these hacking kind of guides, it's the same if you were planning on jailbreaking your iPhone or any of the other things that you can mod and hack these days. It's a custom software that you download and install on the 3DS. And they've highlighted on the homepage of the website a few reasons why you might want to use this software, why you might want to hack it in the first place. So the first thing it mentions is running homebrew software and games. I mentioned the Reddit page that is a bit of a rabbit hole as well that you can go down. I think there's people who are creating custom games now, things that weren't on there, but developing games for the 3DS now,
Hmm.
using this kind of open software that they're now able to port over their homebrew content. So that's one thing. New games by people who are developing them, which is cool. There's also things like bypassing region locks, which I know for some countries that have issues accessing certain types of games, this could be a really useful feature for those.
Do you know what? That I'm all for that because I do think region blocking is bullshit. I've always hated region blocking as a concept. Back whether it was DVDs or games, it really annoys me. So yeah, I'm all for that particular use case. To be perfectly honest.
There we go. Won you over already. The next one I know you're going to love because this is
Right.
very Android. Home
No,
menu customization using community created themes and badges. What do you think about that? You're shaking
no,
your head.
it goes against what I just said. Whether good or bad, I like to go with the manufacturer's decision in that space.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's just my preference.
Fair enough. Fair enough. The next one is modifications of games, so you can download mods specifically for some of the games, which could be quite cool depending on what they are. Sometimes mods can be really complicated, say opening up a game for multiplayer where it wasn't before, or allowing you to play through the web where you couldn't before. I don't know, random things that you wouldn't necessarily think of with modding, but I know on Steam, for example, they've got a whole workshop dedicated to modifying games, which I think is quite a cool idea.
Oh yeah, I'm always fascinated. I love watching sort of YouTubers who've modded games, running interesting hacks. I mean, GTA 5 is one that has got a huge amount of mods around it that do some hilarious things. For me personally, I don't have enough time to play the games as they were intended, let alone modding them to do things that weren't intended.
Yeah.
But I can absolutely see the appeal, and there is some really incredible stuff that the mod community does,
Yeah.
as well as some ridiculous stuff. The obsession with making Thomas the Tank into the bad guys in so many popular franchises always boggles my mind, but it is funny.
I remember it really hops on the trends of memes as well. There was that fish and chip shop that showed up in Skyrim through a mod that was circling the internet for a while, and things like Shrek just turning up and replacing characters as well happens quite often. So there's probably a lot of
certain
that.
characters that have become synonymous with modding, haven't they? Like Shrek and Thomas the Tank, as we've mentioned, and others.
Yeah.
I think it was Resident Evil, the remake, the new one. I want to say it was either Nemesis or actually it was Resident Evil 2, where they'd replaced the bad guy that kind of just appears out of nowhere and smashes through walls with Thomas the Tank, and it was hilarious.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
We'll see. Without this, you're depriving 3DS users of this modding joy.
Yeah, I don't know that it's quite the same on the 3DS, but not
The
most
other thing it could be
workhorse
as well is optimizing games and improving graphics. I know, for example, so Christina plays a lot of Minecraft. She's at the moment, she goes through phases with games. And Minecraft is also famous for having, really quite elaborate mods that you can apply to it. It's usually skins and themes to make it.
Like texture packs.
Texture packs, yeah.
Minecraft looks amazing. Yeah, there's some incredible stuff there.
Yeah,
I agree.
So she gets well into that stuff. But, enhancing the game, enhancing the experience is another element of modding, which is now opened up on this as well. The next one it mentions is save data editing, backup and restore, which I am surprised to read this. I thought that would have been a feature of the 3DS normally, but maybe it's an added feature of this.
I must admit, I barely used the 3DS since I bought it. I don't think, and there must be surely a way to save your games and back them up already. Editing them, probably not. That's a different game. But surely saving them is already standard. Perhaps it's not. But
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's listed here as if it's not, so be interested to hear if that's not normally a thing. The next one is emulation of older consoles. This is where we delve into the the historic games that probably would have been accessible on the store, but now is no longer accessible. So emulating older consoles as well as native playback for the normal DS, so not the 3DS, and Game Boy Advance games as well. So not too far in terms of previous generations.
which is odd, isn't it? Because I know the DS already was backwards compatible with Game Boy Advance. I assumed that the 3DS had some level of backwards compatibility, but I know mine doesn't. But then mine was the new 3DS, and often with their later iterations, they removed some of that backwards compatibility piece. But
The cartridge bit.
perhaps the original 3DS didn't have that.
Yeah. Well,
Surprising.
this might be for the newer version of 3DS as well. You think that
True.
that'll
True.
cover the full spectrum, and I think in a lot of the images, it does look like the new version of it that doesn't have the slot for the cartridge. So again, useful for if they've dropped the space for that cartridge. Now you can use DS and 3DS games, DS and GBA games even. And then the last one on the list is installing your physical cartridges for digital use, which I think is quite a cool idea. So you can plug in your cartridge and then install that permanently.
I see. I was trying to think. I was like trying to make sense of that sentence, and I was staring at it, thinking, "Install physical cartridge for digital use." Okay, yes, I'm with you now. So just installing it for convenience, basically.
Yeah.
And not having to put the cartridge in. Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
Which is a fancy way of saying I'm playing illegal games that I've downloaded from the internet. Honest, I do own the original cartridge. Promise there.
Funny, I didn't read it like that. But,
yeah, it's the same. People do it all the time when they talk about emulation. The old justification was, as long as you own the disc, it's perfectly fine. And then everyone would go, "Oh, well, in that case, then I'll download the game." And yes, I own the disc. Of course, I own the disc.
yeah,
There was software on the PC that I used to use back in the day that would create a virtual CD drive on your PC, so you could mount disk images and trick the PC into running what it thought was a physical disk as a digital. And again, the whole argument for that was, "Oh yeah, I've taken an image of my disk because I own the disk. It's just backup, sir. Honest."
Yeah.
But I'm joking. I think there genuinely are benefits to kind of being able to install your collection and the convenience. You see it with modern consoles. Being able to just switch from one game to another is really appealing, and having to change the disc every time is a pain in the arse, which is one of the pros of going all digital, I suppose.
Yeah.
So if you can install your games and not have to keep putting those cartridges in, I can see the value in that.
But also, I think it's once you've installed the games, you'll have the physical files of that game. So you could create your own archive or preservation of these games long beyond the console actually completely dying as well, and use it for future emulations. I'm not sure how Nintendo feel about that, but you did buy the cartridge, theoretically, and install it and save the files. And if there isn't a console anymore that supports the games, then where else are you supposed to go but emulation?
Nintendo are famously good at reselling the same game over and over and over again. I mean, the number of times that Mario Brothers, the original, has been ported from console to console, and people who are fans still buy it. I've got a number of copies of Super Mario Brothers installed on various different devices, playable in different places. It's exactly the same game, but there's just something about the draw of Mario that you just, you go and do it again. You go and buy it again.
Well, now it's the ultimate versions on the Switch. Where are they going to go from there? Ultimate +1.
Oh, well, exactly. How do you beat Ultimate? But no, I mean, I'm referring to the literal Super Mario Brothers. I mean, if I think about what's behind me, I know I've got it on the NES. I'm 90% sure I've got it on one of the portables. I've got it on the Wii. I've got it on the Switch through the digital virtual console. I've got it on a little Game & Watch special edition thing they made. How many times do you need the same game? But Nintendo are really good at selling it to people. I've got it on the NES Mini Classic thing.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And I've never played it. Look at that.
Me.
All these different versions you've got.
Yeah. I just remembered that I've got one other device behind me which actually still remains right now, hacked, technically speaking, which is the SNES Mini.
Oh, okay.
So the Super NES Mini, the only reason that I've left it hacked or even accepted hacking it was that there were loads of brilliant SNES games back in the day before I rebought this collection behind me that I loved. And that I wanted to be able to, experience again. And because the Super NES Classic comes with the real feeling controller, and it looks the way it does, and it feels fairly authentic. There was obviously a limited number of games that they put on those classic consoles, but it was fairly easy to hack and open that up. But the way that the hack that I was using had been done was such that the interface and the experience didn't change.
Yeah.
All you got was one extra icon in your game carousel. But when you selected it, effectively drilled down into this subfolder of ROMs and let you run one of those ROMs. So the overall experience of what was packaged and sold for me still remains the same, but with a very small sacrifice to access these additional games that I selected. It's a bit like the reason why I've never really gotten on with Raspberry Pi Arcade.
Yeah.
And, people just seem to fill them with games. They're overwhelming. The lists are too much. Again, what I really want is, and what I probably should do, is sit down and curate the games I'm most bothered about.
Yeah.
And I'll just very quickly tell you one thing that I would accept a really good hack for. And there are hacks for this, where anyone writes in and says, of course you can do this, Jay. They're the old arcade games that run on MAME, the stuff that just hasn't been re-released anywhere else. This is the reason why I've got the arcade cabinets behind me, and I love these so much, or I appreciate they're not the best examples of games you can't buy anywhere else, because you can. But the one that I've always wanted is WWF WrestleFest.
WrestleFest.
I used to love playing that arcade cabinet in my local youth club as a kid, and I did get it to work on a Raspberry Pi once upon a time, but I just was never satisfied with the experience. I didn't like using the Xbox controller and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I've always said that one thing I'd love to do is build my own arcade cabinet at some point.
Yeah, I've seen that. It's pretty cool.
And do it with just the games that I cared about. A proper 4-player cabinet with the Simpsons arcade, the X-Men arcade, Turtles that's behind me, but specifically games like WrestleFest. I love that particular game. It's the one that remains difficult to play without going down some sort of less authentic feeling bootleg journey.
You could always buy the controller, like the joystick controller and everything, and hook it up to your PC.
Definitely thought about it. Again, the screen is the display. It doesn't look right on a flat screen. You want it on a proper CRT. There's definitely ways around it. I just haven't spent the time kind of finding my way through it because there's no simple method.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But yeah.
Well, there you go. The only other thing I was going to mention, and I'll bring it up on screen as well, is the subreddit, which is worth having a little delve into. It's got a few interesting things in here, a few things that people are doing with their 3DSs. So check that out. It's called the 3D. I'm going to say 3D Spiracy, even though I know it's 3DS piracy. 3D Spiracy on Reddit. Check it out.
Yeah.
And you can do like troubleshooting as well for like you can reach out to the community if you've got any errors and things like that if you've given it a go yourself. But that's
it's
pretty much it.
There was it's just reminded me, you mentioned that the price of 3DSs had kind of gone up again and they're like holding at their like original RRP.
Yeah.
There was a time with the PSP where their value of a certain version operating system was ridiculously pricey, and it was basically versions of the OS before PlayStation patched out a hack basically that allowed people to put old emulated games on, like SNES games. So there was a point where if you had a PSP that hadn't been updated beyond that version number, the value of it was like way disproportionate to those that have been updated to the latest firmware.
Wow.
Because if it had the old version in, you could basically load homebrew software on and then run emulated games on it. And apparently it was a really great way on those nice kind of PSP displays to run old emulated console games.
Yeah, I bet that works really well. Do you not check your version just to see if it wasn't that version?
No, when I bought it, I did check. It's not.
Oh, fair enough.
And I wouldn't have anyway. I'd have updated it to the latest version because I'm sad.
Well, or you sell it and then just get a normal one. Make a profit. Because you're not bothered about the emulation or anything, so you could sell it to someone.
No, I'm not. I mean, I don't even turn them on. I just like looking at them. Anyway, there you go. An insight into my brain.
So I guess finishing off on a question then, Is it justifiable with the store closing down and eventually closing? What do you think? Is it just more justifiable now to hack it and access the games in these potentially? I mean, it's piracy way, I guess.
That's really difficult, isn't it? I mean, you literally can't, as you said, you literally can't buy them anywhere else. So, are you robbing someone of income? Are you robbing, developers of funds for their game? Well, no, because I guess you can't buy them anymore. The only people that can profit from those games now are third-party resellers, which, probably not that big a concern. It's really difficult because I'm sure legally it's still an issue. But morally, it feels much more of a grey area because of the fact that, as you said, you really don't have any other choice. And Nintendo have taken a view that these games are now lost, and if you want to experience them, it's the only option available to you, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because it's not even, aside from buying somebody else's 3DS with their account installed on it in order to play the games they once purchased, you can't even buy them off somebody else digitally, not legally. So yeah, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, in my personal life, if I was desperate to play one of those games, would I go to the lengths that you've described? I probably would. It's not likely to happen because I'm not that fussed. But if I really wanted to, I probably wouldn't think too much about it.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure in the eyes of the law, it's still probably technically illegal.
Well, I think Nintendo in particular are quite litigious about this stuff. So yeah, I mean, it is interesting debate. But if it's the only way to access a lot of these games, I think it makes it much more justifiable. But I don't know. I don't think Nintendo's lawyers see it that way. But there you have it.
No.
There you have it. The world of 3DS hacking. I think we'll leave it there. So that's all. That's all for today's episode. Thanks for hanging out with us. And don't forget to check us out on all good podcasting services. Check us out on YouTube as well. Subscribe and leave comments and likes and all that stuff. We're starting to stream some games on YouTube as well. So we went live last night and played some Halo Infinite campaign, which was quite a lot of fun. So keep your eyes peeled on YouTube for when we go live for gaming sessions as well. And we'll see you next time.